Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Severe Weather Season Outlook for Queensland 2021-2022 webinar. For those joining us for the first time, welcome. And for anyone who's joined us for our webinars before, welcome back. Before we begin proceedings, I would like to acknowledge and pay respect to the Kulin Nations, who are the traditional custodians of the lands on which we meet. I would also like to acknowledge and pay respects to the traditional custodians of the lands that we are gathered on in all states and territories, and pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. We acknowledge and respect their continuing culture and the contribution they make to Australia. Today, you'll get an in-depth look at what you can expect weather-wise in the coming months and how you can get ready for it. My name is Jordan, and I'll be your moderator today. I'm joined by Mark, who will be producing today's webinar. Together, we will help make the webinar as interactive as possible. Kimber, could we go next screen, please? Before we start, may I ask for your attention as we cover off some housekeeping items. Another one. Awesome. With the current situation as it is in Australia, this webinar will be conducted from our respective homes and office spaces across the country. Please bear this in mind as we may encounter some technical issues during the broadcast. Our broadcast will run for 60 minutes today with plenty of time allocated for questions. This webinar is also being recorded and the video will be shared with you via email. Next slide. For first-time webinar attendees, please see some helpful tips on your screen. Most importantly, please note the chat box where you can send through any questions or feedback for presenters. We want your questions all the way through this webinar, so feel free to use this, not the Q&A box, to send your questions to us during the session, and we will answer as many as possible during the allocated breaks. It is the speech bubble button on the right-hand side of your screen, right down the bottom. It's next to the participants button. The icon will turn blue once it's on. If you want to test out the chat box now, feel free to tell us your name and where you're dialing in from. Thank you to everyone who has sent us questions during the registration process. We've used them to help shape the content you'll see today, and we'll get through as many as we can. Next slide, please. And finally, I'm delighted to introduce you to our presenters. From the Bureau, we have Senior Meteorologist Kimber Wong and Senior Hydrologist Andrew Preece. And from the QRA, the Communications Officer Kate Lanrensick. I know I've gotten that wrong. I'm sorry, Kate. Welcome, team. Kimber started at the Bureau as a graduate in 2018 and moved to the Brisbane office later that year. Her favourite part of her work is communicating weather forecasts to the community and emergency services to help them assess their risks and make informed decisions. Andrew started at the Bureau as a flood forecaster in 2013. His favourite part of the job is working with disaster managers during floods and communicating the flood potential to the public through the Bureau's flood warnings and media interviews with the ABC. And Kate has worked in the public service as a communications professional since 2017. Kate's role is dedicated to the Queensland Government's Natural Disaster Education and Awareness Program called Get Ready Queensland, and it's administered by the Queensland Reconstruction Authority. Kate has assisted with the communication projects through various natural disasters, including the 2018 Central Queensland bushfires and the 2019 monsoonal trough. So we really do have the best possible people for today's webinar. Next slide, please. We have a really packed hour for you, including recent conditions, the climate drivers that are affecting us, the season outlook, and how you can get ready. Let's not keep you waiting any longer and get straight to Andrew. He'll start us off with a look back at what has happened recently, but don't forget, you can get your questions answered today, so please send them in as soon as you think of them. Hit the blue speech bubble button, the chat button, and start sending them in. All yours, Andrew.
Thanks very much, Jordan. I'm going to be taking you through the recent conditions, starting off with temperatures, moving on to the rainfall, and then looking at the sea surface temperatures before passing on to Kimber, who will give you the info on the climate drivers. Firstly, we'll look at the mean maximum temperatures for the year to date, covering obviously January through to September. Pretty much for Queensland, as you can see on the picture in the slide, above average temperature for across much of Queensland, with a few pockets of very much above average for mean maximum temperatures, with the exception of southern parts of the state and around Emerald, where the year to date have been around average. In terms of the mean minimum temperatures, a similar picture in Queensland, with an above average to very much above average mean minimum temperatures for much of the state, with the exception of southern parts from Bundaberg to the border and along the Queensland and New South Wales border. Moving on to the rainfall now for the year to date. Very much a mixed picture across Queensland in terms of rainfall. We've got average rainfall across much of the state, depicted by the white colour you can see on the slide. But areas around Rockhampton and Bundaberg are below average to very much below average, which you can see is that lighter shade of pink sort of colour and the darker shade pink. Also, there are a couple of areas where we've seen above average rainfall, most notably on the North Tropical Coast and Cape York, and also border rivers where we saw a number of flood peaks in July. And I should note that this is the wettest winter since 2016 for Queensland. Looking at rainfall deficiencies in the long term, this slide shows the period starting from April 2018, so just over 3 years ago. And what we can see for Queensland, so the red depicts, or the graduating shades of pink through to red depicts serious deficiency right through to lowest on record. For Queensland, we can see that there's serious to severe rainfall deficiencies persisting in the Capricornia, Wide Bay and Burnett and into the Central Highlands, and in a pocket to the west of the state near to Boulia. Sea surface temperatures. This graphic shows obviously the Pacific Ocean and obviously the Indian Ocean. You can see a box there that's labeled Nino 3.4, and this is the area that we look at to assess whether there is a cooling or warming. And obviously at the moment you can see from those blue shadings that there is currently a cooling in that particular box. This information forms one of the parameters that determines whether we're in El Nino, La Nina or neutral conditions. And Kimber will talk about what this means in relation to the climate drivers shortly. On the left-hand side of that particular graphic, you can see IODW and IOD East. They relate to Indian Ocean Dipole West and Indian Ocean Dipole East, so the western part of the Indian Ocean and the eastern part. And what you can see, the eastern part is very much warmer, and what that can do is that can lead to a negative Indian Ocean dipole, which can result in additional rainfall in parts of Australia, which is what we've seen in the past few months. Now I'm going to hand over to Kimber, who's going to take you through the climate drivers.
Thanks, Andrew. My name's Kimber. I'm just going to run us through briefly some of the climate drivers that can influence the weather in Australia and Queensland more specifically. And then I'll hand back to Andrew, who's going to run us through what that means for our seasonal outlook. So just on this graphic here, we have just an indication of some of the climate drivers that can influence our weather. On the top left and the top right, we have the Indian Ocean Dipole and El Nino Southern Oscillation, or the ENSO, that Andrew has very briefly touched on just before on the current sort of state of those ocean temperatures. I'll talk a little bit more about these two climate drivers shortly. But just while I'm on this slide, I'll just note a couple of the climate drivers that can influence our weather here, other than the Indian Ocean Dipole and ENSO. So on the bottom there, we have the Southern Annular Mode, or SAM, which refers to the north-south shift of rain-bearing westerly winds and weather systems in the Southern Ocean compared to its usual position. The SAM is currently neutral and likely to remain neutral this week, but is expected to return to generally positive levels from October to December, which is a southward shift in that westerly belt of winds. A strengthened polar vortex over Antarctica is currently assisting this forecast positive phase, and also as well being influenced by that increased likelihood of La Nina, which I will touch on shortly. A positive SAM during spring typically brings wetter weather to eastern parts of Australia, and as we move into summer, the influence of positive SAM towards above average rainfall increases over mainland southeastern Australia and into southern Queensland as well. Just in the top centre there, I have the Madden-Julian Oscillation, or MJO, which is a fluctuation in tropical weather on weekly to monthly timescales and can be characterised as an eastward moving pulse of cloud and rainfall near the equator that typically recurs every sort of 30 to 60 days. The MJO is associated with weekly to monthly periods of enhanced and suppressed rainfall over parts of Australia, just depending on exactly where it's located, and can influence the timing, development and strength of major global monsoonal patterns, including the Indian and Australian monsoons. Tropical cyclones are also more likely to develop in association with certain phases of a strong MJO event, and a moderate MJO in the maritime continent would enhance rainfall over the tropics. So the MJO has been active over the maritime continent recently, in recent weeks, but is expected to weaken in the coming week and actually will be more likely to have an influence on our weather as we head deeper into the summer months. And just a couple of other features on this graphic here. We have the subtropical ridge, southeasterly trade winds along the east coast of Queensland there, and the monsoon trough, all features that influence our weather at various times of the year and in fact throughout the year. Under the subtropical ridge, we typically see periods of more settled weather, and the associated southeasterly trade winds along the East Queensland coast result in higher annual rainfall along the east coast than inland areas, and particularly along those more north-south oriented sections of the East Queensland coast. During the Southern Hemisphere winter, the influence of the monsoon trough shifts into the Northern Hemisphere, and the monsoon trough typically enters Australian latitudes in December and has an influence on rainfall and temperature patterns, depending on whether it's in an active or break part of the monsoon cycle. All right, so just touching on the Indian Ocean dipole outlook now. The Indian Ocean dipole is defined as the difference in sea surface temperatures between the eastern and western tropical Indian Ocean, as Andrew mentioned briefly just before. A positive phase of the Indian Ocean dipole generally brings drier than average conditions, while a negative Indian Ocean dipole and a warmer eastern Indian Ocean more generally increases the chances of above average winter and spring rainfall for parts of southern and eastern Australia. Negative Indian Ocean dipole events also make above average maximum and minimum temperatures across the northern tropics of Australia more likely. We have a weak negative Indian Ocean dipole event continuing at the moment, and this has likely been influencing winter rainfall and warmer temperatures across the north of the state recently. We've got the majority of our climate models surveyed by the Bureau indicate that the weak negative Indian Ocean dipole is likely to persist through October, with all models indicating a return to more of a neutral phase or a neutral pattern by December. This is quite consistent with the typical life cycle of an Indian Ocean dipole event, which sees events dissipating in early summer as the monsoon trough moves further south. Nevertheless, residual warm sea surface temperature anomalies are likely to persist as the event declines and are still likely to influence rainfall patterns over the coming months. Now just having a look at the El Niño Southern Oscillation, or the ENSO. So ENSO is the oscillation between El Niño and La Niña states in the Pacific region. El Niños typically produce drier seasons and La Niñas drive wetter years, but the influence of each event varies, particularly in conjunction with other climate influences. Currently, our ENSO status is neutral, but most of the international climate models surveyed by the Bureau anticipate tropical Pacific sea surface temperatures will cool in the coming months, with around a third of the models predicting La Niña thresholds in spring, which is indicated by this graph here. Some of the surveyed models sustain La Niña thresholds until early 2022, which may be long enough to indicate a fully fledged event, which is at least 3 months long. So, given all this, the Bureau's ENSO outlook status is currently at La Niña Watch. There is a possibility that this status may be upgraded, and our Climate Driver update occurs every fortnight, and actually an update will be released this afternoon, so Tuesday afternoon, if you're looking for the latest information on that status. The link to that Climate Driver update will be included at the end of the presentation for your convenience. So in the past, when a La Niña Watch has been reached, a La Niña event has subsequently developed around 50% of the time, so this is approximately double the normal likelihood. La Niña typically enhances spring rainfall in northern and eastern Australia, and this pattern of cooler sea surface temperatures in parts of the tropical Pacific Ocean is likely to be contributing to a wetter than average outlook for parts of the country, which Andrew will speak to in a moment. It's important to remember that even if a La Niña doesn't develop, cooling of sea surface temperatures is still likely to have an influence on our weather over the coming months as well. I'll now just talk a little bit to more of the longer term trends that we see around Australia and globally. So first of all, this trends in coastal erosion and inundation. So globally, sea level rise has risen, sea levels have risen by about 25 centimeters since 1880. And half of this rise has occurred in the more recent decades since 1970. You can expect approximately 1 meter of horizontal incursion for every 1 centimeter of sea level rise. And rates of sea level rise do vary across the Australian region, as you can see on the bottom right-hand map there. The largest increases have been to the north and southeast of the continent. And in these areas, the rates of sea level rise have been significantly higher than the global average, whereas rates of sea level rise along other coasts of the continent have been closer to the to the global average. Now just having a look at trends in heat. So just to note that Australia's climate has warmed by about 1.44 degrees Celsius over the 1910 to 2019 period. This graph shows the occurrence of unseasonal heat throughout the year, and the recent trend shows that intense heat events are occurring more often. Of note, more than half of these intense heat events have occurred in the past 22 years, and 43 extreme heat days in 2019 is the highest on record. I'll also just note that the La Nina in 2020-2021 likely contributed to reduced number of extreme heat days in 2020. I'm just going to hand back to Andrew now, who's going to summarize what all of these climate drivers mean for our seasonal outlook over the coming months.
Thanks very much, Kimber. And in terms of these outlooks, the ones we're looking at the moment are covering November through to January, but as Kimber mentioned, please stay across the Bureau outlooks. They will be updated regularly. Check out the Bureau's website for that. The slide we have here looks at the maximum temperature, minimum temperature and rainfall outlooks for November through to January, as mentioned previously. In terms of for the maximum temperature, there's a below median daytime temperatures are likely in southeastern Queensland, depicted by that slightly bluer shade that you can see in the picture there, with average temperatures, average maximum temperatures across much of Queensland. You will note though that there is a kind of a coastal trend for above median maximum temperatures, pretty much from Rockhampton right through to Cape York and then around to the Northern Territory border, just to be aware of. And in terms of minimum temperatures, that middle diagram, you can see that pretty much minimum temperatures are likely above median minimum temperatures are likely for pretty much the whole of Queensland. And really, what does that mean in terms of things like heat waves? Because we don't have a strong signal for the maximum temperature exceeding the median, but we do for minimum. I guess the individual extreme heat days are less likely compared to, say, recent years. But while they may not be as severe, if a La Nina does develop, then the heat waves may last longer and be more humid, both of which can increase the risk to human health. Now, moving on to the rainfall, as you can see from the picture on the right, pretty much the eastern 2/3 of Australia are likely to see above median rainfall. And for Queensland itself, generally there's a greater than 70% chance of exceeding that median rainfall. Now, I should note before moving on to the next slide, there are the pictures of Australia below those plots that are in green, and they talk to the skill for this time of year in relation to those particular parameters. And the greener the colour, the more skill that there is for those particular parameters for this time of year. Moving on to the bushfire outlook. So you'll see that there's an above normal fire potential over southeastern Queensland. That's mainly driven by the grass and crop growth in these areas. And broadly speaking, that's going from Bowen down to the Queensland-South Wales border and inland to the Warrego. And obviously, in terms of seeing a potential for a wetter outlook, and obviously seeing bushfire still being above normal, that might seem to contradict each other. But because this relates to grass and crop growth, it only takes a few days of very dry, hot conditions for that fire potential to be realised. Moving on to stream flow now. As you can see, the dots there relate to the locations which we have a 7-day stream flow forecast. You can see that the colors range from the orange color, which is low flow, through to the light blue near median flow and the darker blue for high flow. So for Queensland, we've got a median to high flow predicted for the North Tropical Coast and the Cape, as well as southeast Queensland and the border rivers. Those low flow areas that are depicted in that amber orange color broadly correlate with areas where we've seen those long-term rainfall deficiencies that I mentioned earlier. Now moving on to the tropical cyclone outlook for the 2021-22 season. Typically, well, the official cyclone season is officially from November through to April. However, cyclones can occur at any part of the year. And for Queensland, the peak season for, is February and March. And what we're seeing for this coming season, we've got an average to above average number of cyclones expected for the 2021-22 Australian cyclone season. And for Queensland, that's the Coral Sea, the eastern region that you can see on the map, and also the Gulf, which is the northern region. And long term, typically the average number of cyclones in Australia is 11. But for the Coral Sea, for example, the average number is 4, one of which crosses the coast. And for northern region, the average is 3. And I should note that since around the year 2000, the average has actually reduced to around 9 per year for Australia. But I would urge caution and say that just to be aware that tropical lows, which aren't cyclones, can still produce damaging winds, widespread rainfall, and dangerous flooding. And these impacts can extend well beyond the tropics. For example, we've seen remnants of tropical cyclones such as Oswald and Debbie that have actually tracked down the east coast of Queensland and into New South Wales in recent years. So Oswald was 2013 and Debbie was in 2017. So just to be aware that just because it doesn't have a name or isn't named doesn't mean it isn't dangerous. And just for info, the first cyclone of the season will be named Paddy. So, in summary, as you can see, this slide here shows all of the hazards and what we're to expect during this coming season. So the current climate drivers look and antecedent conditions indicates the risk of widespread flooding, tropical cyclones, and coastal flooding and erosion is higher than normal for much of northern and eastern Australia. And we've also see an above average likelihood of an increased likelihood, of bushfire risk for those parts of Queensland from Bowen to the border and inland to the Warrego, as mentioned earlier. The likelihood of heat waves and severe storms remains near average. And it's also likely that the northern rainfall onset will arrive earlier than normal for many locations. And that covers the outlook for the season.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that and starting us off so great, Andrew and Kimber. Before we find out how you can prepare for the upcoming season, let's get to some of your questions. So remember, hit the little speech bubble button on the right of your taskbar and start sending them in. We have the full team on deck, even Kate, who you haven't heard from yet, but she's going to be coming up soon, and they're ready to answer your questions. So going straight to Kimber, we've got a great question from Mark here who says, does a negative IOD and a positive SOI double the impact?
Thanks, Jordan, and thanks for the question. That's a very good question. So negative Indian Ocean dipole and positive Southern Oscillation. Let's think about these two. So positive Indian Ocean dipole events are often associated with El Nino and negative events with La Nina. When the Indian Ocean dipole and ENSO are in phase, the impacts of El Nino and La Nina events are often the most extreme over Australia. While they're out of phase, the impacts of El Nino and La Nina events can be diminished. And just noting that the Southern Oscillation Index is only one indicator, the atmospheric component of the status of the ENSO. So hopefully that helps answer that question.
Awesome. Thank you very much. I'm sure it will. Moving on to Michael. He's asked, are any East Coast lows or large rain effects likely to occur in the coming months? I actually think, Kimber, you're best to answer that as well, so we'll keep you online.
No worries. Thanks, Jordan. And thank you, Michael, I think, for the question.
Yep.
A very good question. So just for general information, I guess, East Coast lows, intense low pressure systems, they occur on average several times each year off the eastern coast of Australia. And in particular, sort of off the coast of southern Queensland, New South Wales, and eastern Victoria as well. They can occur at any time of the year, but more common during those cooler months, so the autumn and winter months, with a maximum frequency, I think, in June. Each year, there's about 10 significant impact maritime lows. That's not necessarily East Coast lows, but still potentially lows over the ocean that can have impact on weather over land. I hope that answers most of the question about East Coast lows, but I guess it's important to remember with large rain events that we can see severe weather, particularly in Queensland. We can see severe weather at any time of the year. In general, for these sort of larger rain events that can happen on shorter timescales, we sort of can see these in the forecast at a range of, say, up to 7 to 10 days in advance. And I guess looking at our seasonal outlook, we can have a look at our climate drivers and see what factors are in play for the season ahead, and in a sense, what factors might be loading our dice. But we still need those shorter term triggers, I suppose, for those large rain events that maybe cause more locally. Hopefully that answers your question, Michael.
Yeah, excellent. Andrew, we're going to bring you back in because Kaylee has asked a question that I think is right up your alley. Has rainfall intensity and duration predictions increased for the 2021-22 season for a tropical low or a cyclone for Queensland, given the severity of weather patterns, so like hurricanes, around the world in the past 12 months, and including earthquakes and volcanoes? This is a very interesting question and a deep question. We've got a very smart audience with us.
Totally agree, Jordan. Yeah, thanks very much for the question. I probably can't touch on the earthquakes and volcanoes, and certainly Geoscience Australia would be well placed to sort of provide information in relation to that. And I suppose in terms of rainfall intensity and duration predictions, whilst we can't sort of pinpoint that for the 2021-22 season, based on the current state of the climate report 2020, observations do show that there has been an increase in the intensity of heavy rainfall events in Australia. So the intensity of short duration, sort of hourly extreme rainfall events has increased by around 10% or more in some regions and in recent decades. So with the larger increases typically observed in the north of the country. So that's obviously something that would impact Queensland. So heavy rainfall events typically caused by weather systems such as thunderstorms, cyclones, and east coast lows, which was touched on by Kimber just then. Daily rainfall totals associated with thunderstorms have increased since 1979, particularly in northern Australia. Again, something that would impact Queensland. And this is due to the increase in the intensity of rainfall per storm rather than the increase in the number of storms in general. And I guess a side note around the climate, as the climate warms, heavy rainfall events are expected to continue to become more intense. So a warmer atmosphere can hold more water vapor than a cooler atmosphere. And this relationship alone can increase moisture in the atmosphere by 7% per degree of global warming. And this can cause an increased likelihood of heavy rainfall events. I would say, that's talking about the history in general. Based on the data. As Kimber mentioned, it's really important to stay across the weather forecasts that look out 7 to 10 days, but also our other products such as severe weather warnings and severe thunderstorm warnings, which will allude to high intensity short duration rainfall events throughout the season. So please stay across the Bureau's website for those as we get into that forecast and also the warnings period. That answers your question, Katie.
Yeah, I think fantastic. So we've got a question here from Glenn. He's asking, is it too early in the season to have an idea what we may see for cyclones in the North Coral Sea this season?
I might take that question, Jordan.
Sure.
Thank you for the question. So Andrew did cover briefly our tropical cyclone outlook for the season. So in the season ahead, the 2021-22 season, we do have a 66% chance of seeing more than the average number of cyclones in the Coral Sea, that eastern region, and we also have to look across to the northern region, the Gulf of Carpentaria as well, for tropical cyclones that may sort of develop there or move across that part of the world as well. The long-term average number of cyclones in the Australian region has been on a declining trend, so more around the sort of 9 cyclones per season across the whole Australian region. And as Andrew mentioned as well, that there's a long-term average for the Coral Sea is 4 cyclones per season, usually one of which will cross the coast. So hopefully that gives you a bit of an indicator as to what the season may hold. Yeah, and hopefully that answers that question.
Yeah, we are asking you to peer into the crystal ball a little bit, so we do know that it can be a little bit difficult, but yeah, I think that was a great answer. Darren has asked, and this question does come up a lot. How do you come up with the cyclone names?
That's a very good question. I'll happy to answer that one. So this the list of names is defined before the season starts, and in fact you can go onto our website and see the list of names for coming cyclones to come. And if you have any suggestions for cyclone names as well, you're welcome to submit them to the Bureau for consideration as well.
Oh wow, Jordan's not a bad one. Just putting it out there. So we're going to get to a question from Patrick now. Speaking of cyclone names, I believe that's the next one of the season, right? That you just said. Does the BOM provide a heat weather warning service in Queensland?
That's a very good question as well. So we have, in terms of heat waves, a couple of products that have been issued in previous years and still issued this year as well. So on our website, linked from the main page, actually, you can scroll down the page and there's a heatwave products section. And you can have a look at the heatwave assessment maps for recent days and also the heatwave forecast for the coming week ahead. So I would encourage you to check out those maps to see what areas of Australia are at most at risk for heat waves in the shorter term. This season as well, we are likely to be issuing heatwave warning service for the first time as well. So I would encourage you to check out our warnings page as soon as that starts up, should be in the coming months.
Okay, Neil has asked, and you've just been talking about the different things that are available on the Bureau's webpage. Maybe you can help Neil out here. He's interested to work out the towns with higher than usual rainfall between a specific time period. He said November and March. Is there a breakdown that's available somewhere?
I think that question was from Neil, was it? Thank you,
It
Neil,
was.
for the question. That is a very good question. At the moment, our outlook is sort of on a map scale with sort of a spatial representation of exactly where we're likely to see the above median rainfall potentially. And unfortunately, I don't think we have a breakdown of exactly which towns or which specific locations in there are likely to see the above median rainfall. Broadly speaking, just thinking about the slide Andrew presented with our rainfall outlook for the season ahead, most of Queensland looks like above 70% chance of seeing that above median rainfall. There's a really, really nice resource on our website as well, on our climate page, the rainfall and temperature outlooks for the season ahead. I think I have a link to those later on in the presentation if you want a direct source to those outlooks, where you can zoom in on certain areas of the state a little closer and see exactly what sort of percentage chance you have in those areas. Unfortunately, it's not so easy to put the exact town locations in, but it should give you a general idea. And you can also have a look at the median rainfall, the seasonal median rainfall on those maps, and also what different percentage chance of seeing above a certain number of millimeters for the months ahead on those maps as well. So hopefully that's a really useful resource there. And as I mentioned, the link is at the end of the presentation. We'll get to that.
Great, and don't be afraid of trying to write down that link as quickly as you can. We will be sending a copy of the presentation to anyone who's registered. You'll be getting not only the link to the email, but also you'll be getting a copy of the presentation. So really easy to follow up on there. And we're going to go to one last question, but this is just the first of 2 question and answer sessions. So we will have another question and answer soon, but we're going to hear from Kate in a minute. Before that, Janica, I hope I've said that correctly, would like to know, at what frequency does BOM update soil moisture maps?
Thanks very much for the question, Janica. I can take that one. So in terms of the soil moisture, we have the information that's updated. I think the models run pretty much on a daily basis, so that should be available pretty much every day that should be updated. So you'll start to see obviously periods of dry weather, those soil moisture sort of indicating dry conditions, and when we've got those extremely wet conditions, we'll start to see those. But the map is updated on a daily basis, and I think we have that information going back pretty much from sort of 1910 right up to yesterday, effectively, which is also available on the Bureau's website.
Fantastic. As you work at the Bureau, you start to learn more and more stuff, and I learned how we actually get the soil moisture index. It is fascinating. So check out the website as well for that kind of stuff. So as I did say, that is the last of our questions for this session, but we will have another Q&A session coming up really soon. Karina has put her hand up and said that she would like Cyclone Karina to happen. So maybe you can jump on our website and put that in. And a big thank you to Tam, who is part of the Bureau team as well. She is in the background answering questions as well. So if it doesn't get to us, Tam will take care of it. So we've got plenty of people on deck to get to your questions. Keep sending them in. We love to answer them. It's coming up, our final session, in just a little bit after we hear from Kate. She's from the QRA, and she's going to discuss the steps you can take to get ready this season.
Thanks, Jordan. And thanks everyone for having me. I'll have to go onto the website and see if Cyclone Kate's on the list. It's been really good to hear Kimber and Andrew talk about what we can expect over the next few months. I know it can be a bit overwhelming this time of year as we do hear more and more about severe weather and when there is a greater potential for disasters to happen. But this week is Get Ready Queensland Week, so it's a time where we're asking everyone to be ready for potential disasters over the summer. And actually being prepared can be the difference between staying safe and putting yourself and loved ones in danger. So today I'm going to give you a few tips on what you can do in your home and your neighbourhood to make sure you are ready. So there are 3 steps you can take to prepare for disasters, which I'll go through today, and they include understanding your disaster risk, how to make a household emergency plan, and also how to pack an emergency kit. And so the first is to know what kind of risks you're going to face this season. And just by tuning into this webinar, you are already miles ahead. But for a little bit more background, disasters can happen anywhere at any time. And Queensland is actually the most disaster impacted state in Australia. However, 1/3 of us actually believe we have a low risk of being impacted. So the 4 main types of disasters in Queensland, just for a bit of background, are obviously flood, storm, cyclone and bushfire. And we know from what Kimber and Andrew are saying that there will be a wetter than average season this for most of the state over the next few months. And then there's parts of southeast Queensland which are facing higher bushfire risk. And so now you need to think about your personal circumstances to get a better understanding of how these hazards might affect you. And just next one, please. And so thinking about your home and neighbourhood right now, just ask yourself a few questions. So do you live in an area prone to flooding? Has your home flooded before, or do you have neighbours who have been flooded before? And what about the streets surrounding your home? Even if your home isn't flooded, could you become isolated if those roads around you are? And do you live near bushland? Even if you're not right next to the bush, you can still be at risk of bushfire. And so that's when you can start looking around your home for other risks. So do you have branches overhanging your home or overgrown grass? I know that Andrew mentioned before, you know, the higher bushfire risk in southeast Queensland is because of the rainfall, and that includes overgrown grass. So it's about cutting down any overhanging branches and making sure you're mowing your lawn regularly, just to make sure you're reducing the risk there. Also, trees close to your home can become dangerous in strong winds during a storm or a cyclone. And so think about any of those items or any other loose items in your yard, like garden furniture or trampolines, that will need to be tied down before a storm or a cyclone. And speaking of strong winds, if you're living in North and Far North Queensland, just think about whether your home is built to withstand strong winds and cyclonic winds as well. And so living in Queensland, you are likely to face multiple risks, and your risk can actually change over time as well. So even if you've lived here and in the same home for years and never been impacted, you still do need to be prepared. And one of the easiest ways to learn more about your risks is to talk to your neighbours and your local council to find out the history for your area. And this is particularly important if you've just moved to Queensland. And if you know someone who has just moved to your area, make sure they know about the history of disasters so that they can prepare as well. And you can always send them to the Get Ready Queensland website as a place to start. And that's the website there on the screen, but it's also getready.qld.gov.au. Okay, so now you know your risks, but what if the worst actually happens? Going through a disaster is extremely stressful and scary, and the best way you can support yourself and your loved ones for a situation like that is to plan for it. So now's the time to make a household emergency plan. And this is a document that details everything you need to do, where to go, and who to call in an emergency. So this week, make time to sit down with everyone in your household and talk about what you'll do if a severe weather warning is issued for your area. Talk about where you'll meet during a disaster if you're not home. Write down the numbers for everyone in your household, as well as your school, doctor, local council, utility providers and insurance providers. And also make arrangements with family and friends out of town to stay with if you need to evacuate. And write down those details on your plan as well. We like to rely on our phones a lot at the moment, or now. But if your phone runs out of charge, it's really important to have a hard copy of all of your plans so that you know it's there when you need it most. So in a disaster, your local council will set up an evacuation centre, but this is a last resort, but it is a safe option if you're unable to stay with friends or family. And make sure you talk to your local council about your options, but that's why now is a really great time to talk to those family and friends out of town to make those arrangements early. And don't forget to include your pets in your emergency plan as well. So many evacuation centres don't allow for pets, so you'll need to think about where your pet can go if you do need to evacuate. It's good to keep your emergency plan in somewhere everyone can see it. I like to keep mine on the fridge, but you can write your own plan, or you can download a template from the Get Ready Queensland website at getready.qld.gov.au, and you can download that one there, and there's pre-filled questions that you can just go through and answer. It takes about 20 to 30 minutes to do. And so the final step is to pack an emergency kit for your household. Natural disasters can cause disruptions to your power, gas and water, and also block access to your local shops. And if that happens, you could be isolated for a few days. So it's good to have a few supplies on hand. You don't have to put much in your kit, just enough to keep your family comfortable for a few days. And so for urban areas, we recommend having enough supplies for at least 3 days. But if you live in a more rural area, consider stocking up supplies for at least a couple of weeks. So your emergency kit is going to be pretty similar to what you'd take if you were going camping. If it helps, you can screenshot this list, or you can get a full list of emergency kit items on our website. So you can get a big plastic tub and pack it with things like non-perishable food, water, torch and spare batteries, a radio so you can tune into warnings, a phone charger and a power bank, a first aid kit with your medication, scripts and other medical supplies you might need, toiletries, spare clothes, copies of important documents like your license, birth certificates and insurance, a camping stove, face masks and hand sanitizer, and anything else you might need to stay comfortable for a few days. We also recommend packing a board game or two to help pass the time. And don't forget a can opener as well. There's going to be a lot of canned food in there, so that's pretty important. So I know this seems like a lot, but if you look around your home, you might actually be surprised at how much you already have. It's really important to remember that you don't need to, and you shouldn't be buying everything at once. You can just make a list of the items you need and purchase them over time, one by one, just over the next couple of weeks. So there are the 3 steps to help you get ready. So if you can complete each of those 3 steps, you will be better prepared and able to respond to a disaster if it happens. But there's a couple of things on top of this that you can keep in mind over the next few months as well. So whether you're a renter or a homeowner, it's good to make sure your insurance policy is up to date. So make sure you make some time to call your insurer this week to make sure you're covered. We've got 9 questions that can help with that conversation, and they're on your screen now, and you can take a screenshot of those. But again, they're on our website. You can go back to later whenever you need them. And also, if you're holidaying around the state this summer, make sure you know your risks and stay safe. Queensland's diverse environment is what we love most about living here, but it also means you'll have very different risks depending on where you are. So do your research before you leave so you know your risks, and then also make a plan and pack some essentials in the car, just like you would at home. I know natural disasters are the last thing you want to be thinking about when planning a holiday, but I promise you'll be able to relax and enjoy yourself even more knowing you're prepared. So there's plenty of information about everything I've talked about today available on the Get Ready Queensland website at getready.qld.gov.au. If you do need any advice, you can always send us a message on Facebook and Instagram at Get Ready Queensland, or you can speak to your local council. Better yet, you can also ask us a question in the chat box on your screen. But if you just start with those 3 steps to get ready, you'll be well on your way. Thanks, everyone.
Excellent. Thank you, Kate. I hope that gives you a lot of information on how you can prepare for the next few months. I don't know about the board game, though. I want to reduce the tension in my family, not increase it. We're all incredibly competitive. I want to invite Andrew and Kimber to join us again to get through some more of your questions. This is your last opportunity to ask our panelists, so please send them in and we'll get to as many as we can. And Kate, you were just talking, we're going to keep you on because we've got a question that's come through from Sharon, and she's asking, is there any plan to include a Get Ready section for more rural areas and additional information for farmers?
That's a good question. Thanks, Sharon. So the Get Ready Queensland program and website is statewide advice, but we definitely recommend you speak to your local council for more tailored advice. So how you get ready is completely dependent on where you are in the state and your personal circumstances. So I know that makes it a little tricky, but I would absolutely talk to your local council. There's also Business Queensland has a really good website for primary producers, and I can share that that link after the webinar's over. I can send that over to you, Jordan, to share around. But there's some nice tailored advice around what you should do and how you can prepare.
Okay, fantastic. Karen has asked a question, and this will go back to the climate guys. What are the chances of another severe bushfire event this year?
That's a very good question. So I guess it's important to remember that bushfires are a natural occurrence in Australia, so it's quite normal for us to have bushfires. Andrew touched on our bushfire outlook for the season. So there are areas of Queensland that are looking like they have above normal fire potential. So the sort of central Queensland coastal parts down into the southeast and inland from the coast across the southeast of Queensland as well. So in these areas, we do have above normal fire potential, and for a couple of different reasons, mostly across southeast Queensland because of that grass growth we've had from follow-up rainfall during winter and in the summer months as well. Across the central Queensland coastal parts, the map we showed a little bit earlier in the presentation as well is that long-term dry. So still looking at long-term rainfall deficiencies in that part of the world and drier fuels available there if bushfires do occur. So these are areas of main concern for bushfire potential this season. What I might just say is that our rainfall outlook does look a little bit more promising in terms of that bushfire potential, but until it rains, we still have those areas of concern across Queensland.
Sure. Okay. Fiona has asked, I'm in Cairns, and what would you mean by earlier than normal, since normal is already pretty varied where she is?
That's also a very good question. So the northern rainfall onset, or the wet season onset, is is typically just after Christmas or around Christmas time, and is actually defined by the onset of rainfall in Darwin. It can be sort of extrapolated a little bit across northern parts of the country in general, but this is typically the time when we start to see that rainfall really ramping up across northern parts of the country. Just given the climate drivers in play and their current current and forecast status, it does look like we will see a little bit of an earlier onset to that rainfall season.
Okay. Dylan has asked, when will we expect the above average rainfall to commence? Will it be following 3 months of La Nina or will it be sooner?
Thanks, Jordan. I'll take that question. So, I mean, if you look at the outlook for November through to January, as was shown, it's showing obviously for eastern 2/3 of Australia that we're an increased likelihood of above median, and for Queensland generally 70%, above 70% chance. If you go onto our climate pages, you can certainly see, obviously that's a lumped up next few months, but you can actually see the next week, the next couple of weeks. So you can actually start to see when those when there's a higher chance in this sort of broken down into smaller periods as well, including obviously for October, for November on an individual basis as well. What you'll see there is, be able to indicate whether something in the next week or two is likely.
Okay. Dave, he's asked, and this will probably be a question for you, Kate. Can you direct me online to online information for disaster response in Queensland?
Yeah, so there's some information on the Get Ready Queensland website. Thanks for your question, by the way. You can also go to the Queensland Fire and Emergency Services website as well, and we can share those links around. But if you can search Get Ready Queensland and also Queensland Fire and Emergency Services. There's plenty of information on those two sites. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you, Kate. Craig has sent in a really interesting question, actually. Although we are seeing an overall reduction in the number of tropical cyclones, are we seeing an increase in the severity of the ones that do form? Kimber, that seems up your alley.
Thank you, Jordan. I will attempt to answer that question. Unfortunately, I probably don't have a very satisfactory answer. So yes, as you're right, as we over the longer term trend, I suppose, has been a declining trend in the number of cyclones in the Australian region, particularly in those more recent decades. But the trend in severity of cyclones is actually harder to quantify. So I probably couldn't give you a straight answer there. Unfortunately, sorry about that.
Okay.
Just to add to that, sorry, Jordan.
No problem.
I think the key point as well, though, is that it only takes one cyclone, irrespective of, the severity. It does only take one cyclone to cross land or cross near the coast for impacts to occur. And as Kate's provided some great advice in terms of how people can help to get ready if and when that's as we've seen, the average of one crossing the coast from the Coral Sea happens this season.
Okay. Charmaine has asked, because we're talking about this increase or decrease in cyclones, with the higher than average rainfall expected and higher than average tropical cyclones expected in Queensland, what's the likelihood of another flooding event?
I'll take this one as the flood forecaster in the room, so to speak. So I guess the flooding is driven by various different parameters. So I think Janica asked about soil moisture. So that's kind of the conditions on the ground and at that particular time, the wetness or dryness of the catchments. That can play a huge part in whether we see flooding from even some significant rainfall totals. So that means that when we see dry catchments, there's ability for the catchments to soak up some of that rainfall in the first part before we see water running off and into rivers and creeks. So really the antecedent or the current conditions of the catchment play a significant role. In terms of flooding actually occurring, that can really depend on the catchments that see that rainfall. So the East Coast catchments, for example, tend to respond a lot quicker to rainfall, especially up in the North Tropical Coast, where you can see those significant intensity of rainfall and duration events. Whereas out in the Gulf and in southwest and inland Western Queensland, you can see very much slower responding rivers. And that talks to the need for, say, regional people to have for example, 2 weeks kit, because those rivers can actually cut off roads and roads for long periods of time, as we've seen in 2019. So really, once we see that rainfall forecast coming into play and the severe weather warnings, we'll also start to see the flood watches and the flood warnings on the Bureau's website. So I just urge people to keep across the forecast for the rainfall and then also to see what that means in terms of flooding. The flood watches and also the flood warnings will hopefully give you the information that you need in order to help you stay safe. And as Kate's already informed you, how you can make some preparations now in order to be best prepared for the season ahead.
I might
Okay.
also just jump in there. Sorry, Jordan.
No, this is fine. I mean, this is why we got you guys. You're the two best at this, so please go ahead.
Awesome. So Andrew has touched on sort of more catchment-wide riverine flooding potential and what that might mean across the state as well. But you can also have those more intense and short duration rainfall associated with, say, thunderstorms or cyclones or even east coast lows and more transient systems that can cause very localized intense rainfall, heavy or intense rainfall over short durations. And sometimes in these cases, when the rainfall falls down so heavily in such a short period of time, it actually doesn't matter how dry the catchment is, because the amount of rainfall falling at that period of time can lead to flash flooding. So if the risk of this sort of rainfall is occurring, we will issue severe thunderstorm warnings or severe weather warnings as well to highlight that risk across sort of more localized scales.
Okay. Kate, did you want to jump in as well? We seem to be going around the table here. No?
Andrew's pretty much nailed the get ready advice. Yeah, just the importance of being prepared, and you can make those preparations now.
Yeah, exactly. And I think this will probably be our last question, unless we have a couple more that come in that we can get to quickly. But this one seems a bit meaty. Michael has asked why the rainfall deficiency in Capricornia in the past 18 months, yet tropical Queensland has had a good wet season these last few years. Is it northwest ingress of tropical moisture or another reason?
This is a very good question and quite a complicated response potentially. I think Tam has maybe put some mention in the chat there as well. It is unfortunate that we have seen those areas of central Queensland miss out on a lot of the rainfall over the past couple of seasons, despite that sort of wetter outlook with some of the more favourable, I suppose, climate drivers in play the last season in particular. But I guess it's just important to note that while we can have, say, a loaded dice with, potentially reaching La Nina thresholds, indicating a wetter outlook for the season ahead, you still need to roll the dice. So you still need to have that weather occur over your area, and a lot of other climate drivers can be in play at the same time. So while there can be some indications of a wetter outlook, and there has been in the past year as well, there are areas that may not see that rainfall outlook eventuate. Hopefully that answers that question a little.
Yeah, I'm sure he's got a great answer from you guys and from Tam as well. So that looks like all the time we have for questions today, but there was a lot of information to take in earlier. So if you did miss the start, Kimber, would you please summarize what we spoke about today and where people can find more information?
Absolutely. Thanks, Jordan. So just to summarize, we've just covered recent conditions, so maximum and minimum temperature means for the year that we've seen so far, and also the rainfall that we've accumulated this year. So that was what Andrew covered in our first section there. I talked a little bit about the climate drivers in play that have been in play recently and will be in play over the coming months. And Andrew touched on what those climate drivers in play means for the rainfall and temperature outlooks for the season ahead, as well as a few different outlooks in there. There's a couple of links on this page here that hopefully you'll find useful. I'll just skip to we've got the Know Your Weather link just there in case you'd like to find out more information about what sort of weather can lead to risks for you. But the climate section here, our climate driver updates, as I mentioned a little earlier, they are updated fortnightly, and there will be an update on Tuesdays, and there will be an update this afternoon. So if you are looking for the latest for the outlook for those climate drivers and their status, that's the link there that you can follow straight to our webpage. The second link down there, the rainfall and temperature outlooks. This is hopefully a useful link for, I'm so sorry, I've forgotten the name of the person who asked the question about certain areas and their chance of seeing above median rainfall. But this link here takes you to our quite detailed rainfall and temperature outlooks that have some really useful maps that you can explore there for various parts of the country and Queensland as well. And then just this third section here, tropical cyclones. We've got our outlook with a lot of information about the tropical cyclone outlook that was released on Monday. So you can follow that link there to get that information. And for general information on tropical cyclones as to their seasonal frequencies and how they form and what their names may be. The list of names is on this link under the general information there. So our Tropical Cyclone Knowledge Center has a lot of really, really interesting information there as well. Thanks, Jordan.
Awesome. Thank you, Kimber. If you'd like to get Bureau information on your favorite platform, why not connect with us on social media, our blog, or our excellent BOM weather app. And you can subscribe to receive updates direct to your inbox from the Bureau about everything the team have talked about today or information on upcoming webinars. So that brings us to the end of today's webinar. For questions we didn't get to, please email weatherquestions@bom.gov.au. A big thank you to Andrew, Kimber, and Kate for your time in developing the content and sharing your knowledge with us, and to Brian and Tam for answering questions in the background, and our producer Marg as well. And to you, thank you for tuning in and joining us today. We hope you enjoyed the session, and we do hope you'll join us again next time. If you'd like to continue the conversation, please use the hashtag BOMWebinars in your LinkedIn posts. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this session has been recorded, and we will have the video ready for your on-demand viewing pleasure in the next couple of days, so you can share it around with your friends and family. But most importantly, we want your feedback. It is our aim to bring you the highest possible quality webinars, but we can't do that unless you share your experiences with us. So once this webinar closes, a short survey will pop up on your screen, and we'd be very grateful if you could complete that anonymously for us. Once again, thank you for your time. We look forward to seeing you again soon. Goodbye.